Well, welcome again to class discussing suicide and suicide survivors. One of the topics that I feel like I wanted to address a little more fully is this question of the terminally ill and their own voices' contribution to the request for euthanasia. And this article is about 10 or 15 years old, and it's from an Asian context. So some of the issues that are raised in the article are specific to that particular ethnic and religious context. And some of the issues I think are universal. And we can draw some conclusions from the article that then might shape our pastoral practice around this issue that's becoming increasingly important. The question of when and whether and how to support people who are considering ending their lives because of unbearable pain, because of illnesses that are terminal. And so there's an emphasis. Yvonne Mock talks about an emphasis on patient autonomy in medical context, but there's also a sense in which doctors at the point when this article was written still didn't know what to do formally with requests for euthanasia. And then the particular point of the article is then to look at why patients desire euthanasia, especially in this hospice setting in Hong Kong. So 6 patients, and then the interviewer is going to take a hermeneutical approach, so a kind of an approach to meaning making where you analyze the statements that as a person makes and try to infer back to concepts from those statements. 6 patients were recruited who were able to talk about their illness experience and then also were interested in the termination of life. And there were several factors that played a role in these requests. One was the reality of the disease progression and how much that was a factor in a person's life. If they were looking at a really clear disease progression with very clear symptom prognosis, that could contribute to someone asking for euthanasia. There were also, interestingly, in terms of our class, there were a variety of kinds of role loss, including symbolic loss and loss of relationship, loss of function in one's life or relationship, that contributed to the desire for euthanasia. There was also a kind of role loss for the person who was feeling useless. Might have been a caregiver before, but now was in the position of being receiving care and not wanting to be cared for. For some people, it sounded like there was an experience of real and current pain. One person said that breathing is suffering. So in that situation, when pain is a current factor, you might ask yourself kind of, what are the ethical presumptions that I have around this important issue, and how do I think of them in terms of pastoral care? So if someone is in a situation of chronic, intractable pain that isn't solvable, you might wonder whether you are in favor of at least having this option in your pastoral care. So for someone for whom breathing is suffering, do you think of euthanasia as one potential choice for that person? That's a reasonable choice. So some people in the hospice role talked about a kind of a paradox that's at the heart of a lot of these discussions of euthanasia: a wish to live but can't live, wish to die but can't die. And in this situation, the doctors were less forthcoming maybe than a patient would have wanted about euthanasia as a possibility. Again, this is a few years ago in a particular religious and political context. People who wanted euthanasia faced the same thing as people who were in a terminal illness role of different kinds. So similar testimony to things you might have heard from Spearstra and Anderson, for example. death anxiety, fear of being a burden, fear of being alone. Many people experienced a kind of fear of what it would be like to die, and then a fear of doing that alone. So here's the really humanizing aspect of this discussion for me. In the discussion of euthanasia as a possibility, if you're not too afraid of that conversation, then you find wrapped into it all these very deep existential human meaning-making concerns, pastoral care concerns of the first order, that then can help you shape your pastoral care. So the discussion of euthanasia includes a discussion of the deepest fears and existential concerns, with the desires for connectedness, care, and respect, understood within the context of the patient's whole lived experience. That's from page 348. It's probably one of the most memorable phrases in the whole article for me. So a person's desire for euthanasia touches on some of the deepest themes in their lives and should be talked about symbolically when a person raises this concern, to try to understand what that person stands for, what they desire within the context of their whole life. So in a Confucian culture, many of the patients in this hospital are Chinese. There's a common notion that you'd be, in a communal culture, that you'd be willing to sacrifice yourself for the good of the family. So there was a thought that some patients were thinking along those lines. There's also a concern about what are perceived to be long, chronic, and undignified deaths. And these patients are more likely to want physician-assisted suicide. And physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia often comes along with existential distress. So meaninglessness in present or past life, loss of social function or role, feeling emotionally irrelevant, dependency, burden, separation, grief, and why me? So a few of us might have come from or live in states where physician-assisted suicide is a possibility. Others of us, this might be more of a theoretical conversation unless someone is really intent on moving to a state or a country where this is a possibility. Nevertheless, I think it's an important conversation to be prepared for. And my thoughts about physician-assisted suicide are that the church and the family and friends should do everything possible to make physician-assisted suicide not necessary. So they should be the ones who provide the meaning context and the support around which life begins to be meaningful again. Whether it's Karen Spierstra writing her book with her family's help, or creating art with her friends towards the end. Giving people those kinds of relational connections towards the end that will try to help fill in some of the gaps on the meaning making. But I've seen enough of people's chronic pain and pain in hospital settings to make me think that euthanasia should really be a possibility for people. But they need to. But it needs to not be a family secret. It needs to not be a sudden decision. It needs to be something that everybody's included in, where people are able to share meaning making back and forth. So you might think about opened or closed processes in emotional secrets. Open or closed adoption, for example. You might again think about open. You might think of euthanasia as kind of an open approach to the end of life, whereas suicide becomes a closed approach or foreshortening. But those are kind of loose categories. But euthanasia has the potential, I think, to allow people to grieve ahead of time in situations where there's chronic distress and suffering that are really outdoing all the other human goods that come along with a life of dignity and purpose. And fundamentally, I think it's really a person's spiritual discernment in relationship to their life of faith and relationship to God to make that decision. But once they have made that decision, it's a pastor's role to come alongside and discover, try to be sure that they're not doing it simply because they're afraid of being a burden on their family and they're just afraid of having some of those conversations with their family. around these new caregiving or sick roles. So a pastor has a distinctive role to play in helping a person who's considering euthanasia to determine whether they're considering euthanasia because of intolerable pain, because of situations where the illness experience outweighs all the goods in one's life, kind of objectively, or whether a person is just afraid of an emotional process that's kind of an inevitable part of death and dying, or is afraid of having the hard emotional conversations with their family members, and is looking towards euthanasia as a duck, in a sense, of avoiding some of the loss ahead of time, the anticipatory grief conversations. So I think our fundamental responsibility as pastors is to make euthanasia less necessary, but I think in the extreme cases of very extreme human suffering, where there's no known treatment and pain is excruciating, or debility is long-standing and it takes away a person's entire dignity, they should have a right to decide at some point, some marker. They might say when they're no longer able to speak, or some other marking point in a disease, that they agree with their family and they have open communication with their family that that's going to be the ending point. And then a pastor should be able to support them. Once a pastor has realized that it's not, they're not avoiding some emotional work with this, they're not avoiding a poor quality of life that the church could somehow respond to, and thereby remove the need for euthanasia. But instead, euthanasia is really one of, in that case, in that kind of limit situation, euthanasia becomes one of the many goods that medicine provides to people at the end of life, when they're surrounded by kind of so many artificial ways of extending one's life that weren't present a few years ago. So medicine is already involved in kind of expanding a person's life. So in these extreme cases of suffering, where a person seems entirely robbed of meaning, it seems to make sense to me that in these extreme cases, when that patient can touch base with their family members and have a conversation about what this means, that it can actually contribute to a person's dignity to have some control over situations of chronic pain and suffering that have no end in sight, and that are really destroying the fabric of a person's life and the fabric of a person's dignity. Again, I mean only in the most extreme conditions. I think the article that we read for today ends somewhat strangely. I think the author kind of jumps to their own conclusions and puts those back on the research data. So I'm not really satisfied with the last couple paragraphs of the article. I think instead a broader place needs to be carved out in our Christian imagination for euthanasia around these particularly difficult places of human suffering, as one of the possible approaches that are medically available. And then we as pastors need a chance to vet that, explore that, and then also work with the family really closely so that this is not a decision made in privacy that's going to contribute to more isolation in the grief process. Okay, so I think it's important to listen to the voices of the terminally ill, but kind of all the way through. Not to cut them off with a sense of premature meaning-making around our own needs or desires, but rather put their witness in the very front and center of the pastoral process, and then see what we discover about the human being and its desires and loves in the light of this important conversation. Okay, thank you again for paying attention during this sacred week when it seemed that Christ did know where he was going and that he chose his death intentionally. And so may we live with that same kind of pastoral imagination that can witness to where God is at work in a person's life and in death, with a deep ability to trust God rather than a need to control our human experience. Okay, God bless you, and I hope you have a good Holy Week. Thank you.